The fourth ritual, Matthew. Matthew was always serious for a younger guy in his mid-30s. He never liked the festival of Saturnalia because it always brought out the worst in people. They got loud, blasted music, and made asses out of themselves in public places. Outside of the city, he had a small workshop where he worked as a carpenter who built furniture. He caught the cult's eye because he was a big, good-looking guy, well over 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. He was married to a good woman, and they had 2 young children. When he got out of work and traveled back home, the streets were packed with people. Since his mother-in-law had been sick this past week, his wife had taken the 2 children to stay with her, to help care for her until she got better. So Matthew decided to stop by the tavern to pick up something to eat for dinner. The cult had been hitting Matthew for months now. He had caught a priest's eye who had informed the others that he wanted Matthew in the cult. The only trouble was that Matthew was a family man who liked to keep to himself. He was a hard worker who worked for most of the day, and after work returned home where he spent all his free time at his house with his wife and children. He never went out drinking, or to parties, or street festivals, or gladiator events. For weeks, the cult had attempted to trigger Matthew to notice them or talk to them, but he always kept to himself. He wasn't the type of man to wander the streets looking for something to do or strike up conversations with strangers. He had a job to do and a family to support, and that was his life. After work, the cult followed Matthew into a nearby restaurant where he ordered his dinner and waited for them to prepare it. In the tavern, a strange man stood nearby with these crazy eyes, staring at Matthew rudely. This irritated Matthew, more so recently, as it seemed that wherever he went, these strange people would always be around, staring at him. He never noticed this before because people for the most part minded their business, but lately he had been attracting the strange attention. The man staring obscenely was an older guy in his late 60s and seemed to be beckoning Matt over to him by motioning with his hand, all the while with this insane smile on his face. Matthew grew tense and slightly angry when all of a sudden he noticed the old man's boots. The man had an interesting pair of work boots on, and Matthew had needed a new pair for months now. Suddenly he felt the impulse to ask the man where he got his boots and open his mouth to talk, but changed his mind at the last second when he saw the expression on the old man's face change to pure excitement. Matt recoiled in disgust, and then the counter person was calling to Matthew, saying that his food was ready to go. Once at home, Matthew felt uncomfortable. He felt like he was coming down with a sickness, and now he felt nervous. He kept pacing around the house and noticed there was a lot of traffic outside. Every few minutes, a stagecoach would race past. He had no idea where this traffic was coming to or going. He decided to call it a night and lay down, but woke up throughout the night with panic attacks. The next day he felt even worse. Early the next morning, he got on his horse and rode down to his workshop. All through the day, strange people would enter his shop. They would either ask him stupid questions, appearing as though they were just wasting time, or they would pretend to look around the shop. But when Matthew looked up from his work, they were always staring at him. The people all seemed strange. Some would glare with evil dead eyes, while others seemed as though they were intoxicated or on drugs. They gave him bad feelings. He noticed this when the shop emptied out, and it wasn't that bad, but then another group would enter, and he'd begin to feel unhappy or agitated again. For the first time in his life, he felt clumsy, and his eyes began to drift out of focus. After cutting the wrong size wood for the 3rd time that day, Matthew thought, I must be coming down with something. I can't get anything right today. The door swung open, and in walked another group of subnormal people with crossed eyes. They hunched around the store, waddling around and staring at him strangely. He never saw so much traffic in the store ever. This was strange even for the festival. Finally, at the end of the day, an old man entered and wanted a table built and delivered to his estate as soon as possible. The old man said his table had broke and he needed a new one quickly for a party that was taking place at his home. The old man said he'd pay double if Matthew could build it quickly and then deliver it to his house by the next night. That night, Matthew stayed late, working on the table. All night long, traffic passed by his store. He tried to ignore the strange people who gave him bad feelings as they dragged their feet past his store, gawking through his windows with frog-like eyes. That night, he decided to stay at his workshop and lay a blanket on the floor when he got tired, but panic drove him up as soon as he lay down. It was as if he couldn't breathe. He decided to busy himself with work on the table again, and early the next morning he tried to go to sleep again, drifted off to sleep for a moment, but then was jerked awake with a start. He finished the table by that evening and then began to load it on his cart. He journeyed to the old man's house, following directions the old man had given him to a remote section of the countryside. He arrived at the old man's house, close to dark, and with the old man's servant, carried the table inside. The old man kept him there, asking him questions and raving about how good the table looked. Matthew smiled, answered the questions, and then politely told the old man that he had to get on the road soon before it got too dark. The old man paid him, and then Matthew left. A mile or two down the road, his wagon wheel broke, and Matthew injured his leg falling off the wagon. Upon examination, it looked like someone had purposely sawed the wheel. When he unlatched the horse from the wagon, the horse broke into a frenzy and bolted away. As Matthew walked away, his heart began to race. He could feel his pulse racing, and a pain began in the center of his back. He tried to keep his wits about him as he stumbled along the dark road, occasionally calling out to his horse. After a ways, he heard a wagon approaching from the distance. As it pulled along beside him, he saw that it was the old man's servant, smiling horrifically while holding up a lantern. Matthew was close to panicking now. He felt on the edge of a heart attack, and when the servant pulled up, it only got worse. The servant appeared to be enjoying all this as he began to laugh, saying, "If you come with me, I'll make the pain go away." "Stay away from me," Matthew managed to say as he trudged along, breathing deep and trying to keep his composure. "If you don't come with us, you will die," the servant maintained, but Matthew walked along, ignoring the man and realizing that all these strange people that he'd come in contact with recently were trying to kill him. Based on how they looked, he knew they were evil, and his only chance was to make it home on his own. Eventually the servant pulled on ahead, and Matthew was alone in the dark. The panic grew worse and worse, and something seemed to be pulling Matthew back and beckoning him to turn around and walk back to the house of the old man. A little voice began to try to convince him that the old man had been nice, had paid him more than he usually got for a table, and the old man hadn't really looked as bad as the others. The pain grew worse, and the panic grew worse, but Matthew pushed on, fighting the pain and the fear with everything he had in his soul. By morning, he had made it back to his village, and at home he managed to fall asleep for some time, exhausted from all the work and walking he'd done. When he got up, he felt slightly better than he had the night before, yet he was still anxious. Without his horse, he walked to his workshop the next day for more of the same. Strange, almost deformed people would walk past his shop or enter, wasting time and stumbling around almost in a daze as though they were sleepwalking. Matthew tried his best to ignore them and focus on his work, even though they made him uncomfortable and sometimes angry. Meanwhile, in the cult, a meeting took place. Higher-ranking priests and cult members agreed that Matthew was stronger and tougher than they expected. They decided if they couldn't get him into the cult, then they had to kill him. So they devised new plans for the ritualistic killing of Matthew. If Matthew was strong enough to resist their magic, they should try to hurt him in other ways. They went through their list of methods. They could hurt him financially by destroying his business. They could harass and attempt to control those who he loved. They could poison his food or drinking water. The cult of apes gathered together as a rank smell of animals filled the air. They had a lot of work to do. So, thousands of years have passed, but it's the same old Vatican cult garbage today. And unfortunately, this is your current United States government now. This is the establishment. The Vatican and the military like primitive people the best, who follow orders and never question authority, even as it degrades itself into a subhuman state and everything is failing around them. Ultimately, this is the alien agenda, the promotion of the most primitive, ape-like people and the destruction of the human being.